welcome to the Minnesota Learning Commons monthly webinar series. Today's presentation is Scrum for Educators, How We Can Get Things Done, Accomplish More, and Stress Less, presented by Mike Smart and Ben Drewelow of Intermediate District 287. If you enjoyed today's presentation, join us next month when Brad Hokinson of the University of Minnesota will present on developing creativity in the classroom. Today's session is being recorded and will be uploaded to the Minnesota Learning Commons YouTube page. If you would like more information about the Minnesota Learning Commons or our monthly webinars, visit z.umn.edu/MNLC Best Summit. And with that, I will turn things over to our presenters, Mike Smart and Ben Drewelow.
Hello everybody. My name is Mike Smart. I'm an innovation facilitator with District 287, and I'm excited to be part of this presentation today.
I'm Ben Drewelow. I'm a classroom teacher, instructional coach at District 287, and I've been practicing Scrum in education here for about 4 or 5 years now, and really excited to do this webcast with you all today.
So we'll dig in and get started. We're going to share a Prezi with you now, so we'll be able to help guide our presentation for this, and I think we should be good to go now. So in the next 45 minutes to 50 minutes or so, we are going to kind of walk through I'm gonna get this started here. There we go. That should work now. We're going to start off, and we're assuming that people know nothing about Scrum. However, if you are a little bit familiar with it, we think some of the things might still be helpful because we've modified things a little bit to kind of serve educational purposes. And best place to start is kind of what is Scrum. And Scrum, in essence, is a process to get stuff done. Its origins come from Japanese culture. And the word Scrum the letters don't stand for anything in particular. It actually comes from rugby itself, which is the part in the element of rugby where two teams kind of come together as a big group and they push together to try to accomplish a goal. So that's where it comes from. It fits within the larger family of agile work management, which you may also be familiar with. And today we'll be using them somewhat interchangeably in our conversation. The goal of our session today is, assuming that you know nothing about Scrum, is that you'll be able to leave the end of this session, at the end of this hour, knowing enough about it to be able to take it and to be able to do a project with it, whether that's an individual project you're working on or a small team project, or perhaps something you may be doing with students if you're involved in classroom education.
So you already signed up for this webinar, so hopefully you have a reason that you care about Scrum. But there's places we found it really useful. So taking Scrum out of where it's typically used, which is like in the tech sector, software development, and applying it to our lives as professional educators, we found Scrum to be really useful around managing personal productivity, just your own workflow, your own workload, the stuff generators in your life that generate the stuff that comes at you to tackle and to do your to-do list, or however you sort of manage work. We found Scrum to really be useful for that, as well as group work, committee and team projects. If you've ever been on sort of a do-nothing committee or a committee that just meets every month and talks but doesn't seem like it accomplishes much, this process could be extremely useful and extremely helpful for boosting people less into clarifying and talking and analyzing and more into doing and implementing. And then it can be used for us in K-12. We found it useful for managing students' IEP, goals and objectives. I personally work in a special education school, so that's been useful for us. Project-based learning, and then just classroom teaching and learning can be a way to even just manage the flow of a lesson or a unit.
I think in particular with students, it's something that often as adults, we're never taught how to manage work. Students in particular often show a decided lack of skills in terms of managing their own work and can be horribly inefficient in how they get stuff done, and this can help there as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so who uses it? So I always jest that, but really I'm serious, that I think you'd be hard pressed to find a software development company that doesn't use either Agile or Scrum in some form. It's very ubiquitous and widespread in the business sector, specifically in software, but you can see the list of major companies and organizations there that use it. We like to think we're a little bit on the cutting edge using it in K-12 education, and for some of you maybe higher ed, but actually we're not alone there either. There are other people around the country and around the world, in fact, who are thinking about this and bringing this type of methodology of getting work done into schools. And so really it's used all over the place, and not just in the US, but globally.
And I think one of the things we'll mention too as we go forward is one of the questions that often pops up is, how is this different than traditional work management like to-do lists? And hopefully that'll become obvious as we go through it, because there's a number of kind of Scrum and Agile principles that get applied to the process that we think, and oftentimes what it shows us is there's a better way to do stuff and a better way to organize our work too. One of the places where we first encountered, and this was the story that I heard that kind of piqued my interest on it, was related, and this is kind of just a little mini quick story on Scrum and one of its applications, was with the FBI Sentinel project. And this story goes back to the 2001 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Towers, where after that happened, the government investigations quickly showed that the FBI had a lot of pieces of information, but they didn't have any ways to kind of connect that information. And so there was data scattered all over the United States. And one of the things that came up from that is that they wanted the FBI to design what they called initially a virtual case file, so that an agent in Florida could look at some work that an agent in Minnesota was doing and be able to compare these two cases and be able to kind of connect this data in a meaningful way, which was one of the things that didn't happen and led to the actual 9/11 attacks. And so they started this in 2002. They spent $170 million in 3 years trying to build a virtual case file system. At 2005, they got to the point they said, this isn't working, we need to start over. So in 2005, they started on Project Sentinel. Another organization, another group started with this. They spent 6 years, they got halfway done, spent $405 million. And then they determined at that point in time, there was a kind of analysis done of the work. They were going to need another 6 to 8 years and $350 million. Then Jeff Sutherland and his team came in and applied Scrum principles. And his argument was, we can do this a lot better. They applied Scrum principles, spent 20 months on it, spent $20 million using only half the team that was originally working on it, and got Sentinel done, and it's a system that the FBI uses today. So after I heard that story, I said, okay, this is worth looking into. And that's kind of what led us into it. And I was pretty dubious. You hear these stories, you wonder how much is true, how much is a little bit kind of stretched reality. But we have found in many cases similar types of things. And I'll share one story with us as we go forward.
So after we learned about Scrum several years ago and in our innovation team in our district, just thinking about how it could be useful to us, Mike and I went and got trained and became certified Scrum Masters, CSM. There's various Scrum roles that you can become certified by with Scrum Alliance. And we started to implement it in our work. And so some of the bigger sort of projects we've done are listed there. Our Northern Star online website, which is becoming, one of the biggest online schools in Minnesota. We've got our strategic planning efforts at the district level. We've used it to manage facets of that plan and that committee work. Myself, when I was an ALC teacher, alternative high school teacher, using it for managing student work projects, particularly summer school projects. We really employed a kind of a Scrum process for that. Building online courses for our curriculum hub within the district, and then also our superintendent and our school board doing some advocacy at the legislature. We actually used Scrum to sort of manage that legislation that we put forward, that our district helped put forward at the legislature a couple of years ago. Anything else you want to say about what we've done with it?
I think we've done a lot of training. It's been about 4 years we've been using it now. And I think we've trained several hundred people in the district, and probably several hundred at conferences and things like that as well going forward. So I'm doing it for a while, and the training, it's the nice thing about it is we'll kind of segue into this next session, which is an overview of Scrum, is that it's not a challenging thing to be able to apply, in particular in education, because most of the projects that we manage in education don't necessarily have the complexity of a software project that's going to involve teams of 100 people. So this inserts time to move in a little bit. That's enough kind of an overview, if you would. Now it's time to move into an overview actually of what the process is. What is Scrum? And how do you do it? And we'll kind of give a brief overview now, and then we're going to walk into our mini simulation. We're basically going to take a task and say, here's this project, and we're going to walk through how you would apply Scrum to that task. And we think that will give you, by the time you're aware, oh, okay, I could use these principles and use this with something that I'm doing. And that's one thing we'd ask you to kind of keep in the back of your head as well, is think about how this might apply to your work, because I think it isn't challenging, and it is something that you can immediately run with. Almost every session we have someone who comes up a couple days later and says, thank you so much, I'm doing it now with this and it's working great. So you don't want to imagine this is something that's extraordinarily challenging or difficult to do. So the nice thing about, there's basically a series of steps that you work through. And we can break these steps down into this process. And the first is, so you've got a project to do, whether it's a group project or if an individual project, you wouldn't have this first part. For any kind of a group project, you're going to define what the roles are of the people in the group. And they break down into a product owner, Scrum Master, and then the work team that's doing the actual work. We'll elaborate more on these going forward. Then the next step is the team gets together and they create what's called the product backlog. And we'll explain this again going forward, but this in simple forms is just a list of everything that's to be done. Then you're going to plan a sprint, and a sprint is a chunk of time to do a certain portion of the work, and we'll talk more about that later as well. Then you get off and you do the work, and one of the big parts of Scrum is that there are stages built into it that allow you to monitor the work as it's going on in highly efficient ways. It's not a meeting heavy type of work system, but there are frequent short meetings, and these are called stand-ups. And we'll talk a little bit what those are like as you go forward. Then at the end of the sprint, you come together and you review your work as a team. And this is where you actually show what's done. You kind of review your process. You talk about what you did well, what things you want to improve on. And then you go back to steps 3 to 7, and lather, rinse, repeat until you get to the end of the project. And that's in essence how a Scrum model or how a Scrum project would work.
Yeah, and I think if you Googled it, you would find like various different infographics and things that would all kind of show you this process. What we've really done though is sort of eliminated a lot of the noise that's really only relevant if you're working in a software development or on that kind of team. So we think we've added some value here for you in this session, really just by taking this process, but applying it to something more generic than like, as Mike said, like a deeply complex software development project. So.
And having said that, there are more pieces that we sometimes add in terms of work estimation, and if it's a more complex project, but this is kind of the core version we're going to talk about now, both in terms of time limitations, and it's a good place to start, and it's very useful, I think. We did mention this. Is it hard to learn? No, it's easy. There are children using it. We can all use it, so it's pretty easy. Let's skip right on.
So, okay, so now comes the simulation. So typically when Mike and I teach about Scrum, we'll do it with like a group of adults, and we will separate people into groups, and people work together on a Scrum team to simulate an activity. And we have a menu of different activity, like things, projects you can do, and you would choose with your table and work through the process. For the sake of this webinar, what we've done is we've chosen one of the projects, the birthday party, and we're going to go through our simulation of it. So just so you kind of know the orientation of the next part of the webinar. So we'll be kind of simulating this Scrum process through the idea of that you're planning a birthday party. So you've got a 6-year-old child, and assume that you're going to do the majority of the work within your family or friend group to plan this birthday party. So it's a project, it's a thing that's coming up for you that you got to take care of. And we're just going to use this Scrum process to simulate how we would get that done.
All right, let's jump in. Let's move forward. So the first thing you do when you start out with the Scrum implementation is you determine the roles that are going to be used in the simulation, the roles of each person. And there are basically three types of roles in a Scrum project. The first role is what's called the project owner. There's usually one, and the product owner is the person who has the final say on the quality of the project. So it's, in this case, it might be the child, or it could be the mother or the father of the home that's going to say, yeah, this is what we're aiming for. So if there's any questions as to what should be done, this is the person you could go to and say, is this good enough? And they're going to say, yeah, this is what we're trying to do. They're the person who has the final say.
The product owner in your line of work, maybe the committee chair, maybe the department chair, maybe your supervisor, your school principal. It's who's ever, like Mike said, has that final say as to what's yes or no. So.
Yeah. Then the majority of people fall into the bottom role there, and these aren't ordered in terms of prestige or anything like that, just the development team or the Scrum team. So most people will be in this group of people. And the Scrum Master is an intermediary really between the product owner and then the development team. Now, in traditional Scrum roles, the Scrum Master actually doesn't do the work, and neither does the product owner. They have specific roles to play. However, it's worth saying that in education, because of kind of the mixed up nature of our educational systems, generally when we do a Scrum implementation here, the product owner actually is often doing things, and the Scrum Master is often part of the team doing things, because we don't have the luxury of having someone independent from that process.
Right. Scrum Master you can think of as process facilitator, or like that referee type role, which if you have the luxury of having that person who's going to be that neutral party in your process, that's great. Like in just thinking in our work lives, we both wear a bunch of hats, and typically so do all of our teammates. And so our Scrum Masters are also usually working on the project or what we're doing. And in some cases with really simple stuff, these roles aren't even critical to really emphasize at all, but we just think it's for your orientation of the process, you should kind of know those roles. It is kind of essential to Scrum at its core.
Yeah.
So.
And again, it's kind of a quick recap. The product owner is the person who has the final yes or no authority to say. The Scrum Master is really the facilitator of the process. And then the development team or the Scrum team are the people actually on the committee or the people doing the work.
Okay, so back to that birthday party. So we're planning a birthday party, and the first thing we wanted to do is create our product backlog. And this backlog, another word for that could just be your to-dos. And this would be done in any Scrum implementation or any Agile implementation where you're going to gather up all the things you need to do. You're going to collect it. I have a kind of a comparison with this. When I was a kid, I was a messy room kid. I don't know if we have other messy room kids on the webinar, but especially in my adolescence, my room was just an absolute nightmare. And so my dad would get bent out of shape about that. And he would say, Ben, you got to clean up your room. And one way he would help me is he would come in and just help me pick everything up and just like throw everything on top of the bed. And then, okay, now we can kind of go through things one at a time. Or let's gather up all this stuff that's on the floor and let's throw it in this Rubbermaid bin. And it's okay there for now. It was already a mess. And now we can go through it one at a time. So that's what the backlog is. It's gathering up everything that you're going to do. And yeah.
Yeah, and I think I'd probably add to that too is the idea that one of the things sometimes people think about is, well, what if you forget something? Or what if everything isn't there? What if you're not quite sure? And Scrum is a process that's really designed to handle chaos. And it's actually kind of one of the principles behind it that says a lot of upfront planning is wasted time because it's very difficult to predict how fast the team's going to work, how challenging things are going to get done. So this is really a list of everything that needs to be done that you can think of in perhaps a half an hour. And don't worry about if you forget something, because if you remember something later, Scrum has a way to build that back into the process. And so with that in mind, you want to?
Yeah, so for our simulation of the birthday party, this was the task list that we came up with. And I won't read all of them, but some of them, for example, buy a birthday cake, make a sign, get invitations, get balloons. So decorate the house, clean the house. So really, this is just, we're thinking about a birthday party that's coming up in a couple weeks, and these are the things that we think we need to get done. So one thing to note with the backlog is one item per card. And the card is sort of one of the tools of Scrum. So we don't want to have like rent a pony, hire a clown, and buy refreshments like on one task card. We want to break those things down as much as we can, not granular to the point of like, okay, I've got to like dial 9 to start my phone call, but we want to have like one task per card at as best we can.
Yeah. Yep. And yes, absolutely. Yep. Great. All right. And so at this point in time with our project, we have a group of people. We have a team. One person has been designated as the Scrum Master to kind of facilitate the process. We've got the product owner or owners who've got the final say, and we have a team of people doing it. And we've got a rough list of tasks that we think we want to do. Now, this next place is really one element. We talked a little bit about how Scrum is designed to handle chaos. That's one way how Scrum is a little bit different than traditional work management systems or a to-do list. Another way that Scrum is different from traditional work systems is that it asks you at this point in time to create what are called user stories out of your tasks, or once you're adept at it, you just start with these user stories. And basically a user story is envisioning that task from the perspective of the person that's going to experience and the value that it brings. So you want to rework some of the tasks from the angle that the customer is doing, or that final person or the person you're designing for is going to use it. Now, that sounds a little bit esoteric, so we'll kind of dig in and just, this is an example of these tasks reworked in a way that's got a user story attached to them. So our first one in the top left was buy a birthday cake. Now we're just going to say our son will enjoy a personalized birthday cake. Another one was to hire a clown. And we've changed that in here to kids can enjoy 2 forms of special entertainment, and this is one of them.
And can I just jump in there, Mike?
Yeah.
So one of the ideas here with user stories is that you're sort of empowering the doer and who's now going to have more choices. So buy a birthday cake. You might think that's a distinction without a difference, but actually our son will enjoy a personalized birthday cake. That does open up possibilities. Whoever's in charge of that now, maybe they know somebody who's like a great baker and they know can make a better cake than you can get at the store or whatever, or they know where the best bakery is in town and they're going to not get the one from, you know, the the big box store or whatever. So it kind of empowers the worker. Then thinking about kids can enjoy different forms of entertainment, that's different than get a clown, right? It kind of opens it up. It kind of empowers somebody to really do the work well, which we find in the Scrum process is really useful. So.
And if I might share a story here too, this might seem a little bit, well, do I really need to do this? It's really beneficial. This is one place in terms of task management where often traditional methods can create work that doesn't necessarily add value. So these cards, actually, you should be able to sense the value behind which each one of these user stories is. Now, some of them may not have a specific user story, and if you have to get refreshments, well, okay, people can enjoy refreshments. There's not that much of a difference. But oftentimes, as groups go through this process, they identify a number of tasks that you can almost just throw out because they don't add value. And the best story I can give for this was when we first started to use Scrum about 4 years ago, we wanted to try it. I wanted to try it on a project that we could test it on. And we had a website for Northern Star Online, which is our online public school consortium through a number of member districts. And we offer courses to students all throughout Minnesota. We had a website, and the website looked like something from 2003 that people had just vomited all over the screen. It was awful. It was an awful website. And we had tried 2 times previously to be able to take that website and build a new website, update the old website, this kind of process to create something that looked good. And so I said, okay, let's test Scrum here. And one of the tasks that we had in that process the times before that was to port the old content of the website to the new website. And both times when we tried it previously, that's where we got stuck, because this old website had hundreds of pages, some of which we didn't know where they were linked from. It was this massive process. We would get 10 hours into this and be absolutely frustrated and give up. And so at this step, when we used Scrum on this process, saying like, we're going to build this new website, what we realized was move all the old content to the new website wasn't a user story at all. It had nothing to do with an important part of it. It wasn't creating value. So we threw that card out and we said, okay, what are the things we want people to be able to do? So a user should be able to search our course catalog. A user should be able to find information on our staff. Our users should be able to understand how to register for a course, and so on and so forth. We came up with about a half dozen user tasks that we wanted the person to be able to do on our website, and we just did those instead of porting all the old content over. What we ended up with was leaving behind about 80% of the pages on the old website, and nobody ever asked for those pages again because they weren't serving any purpose. And that was that one step of shifting that task, that meaningless task that just ended up in the list of things to do, into user stories, which enabled us to get that website done in 2 weeks, whereas we had failed previously doing it in months before that.
That last thing I'd say on user stories just has occurred to me, because a lot of you on here probably have some kind of education background in terms of your training. It's almost like that students will be able to, or that I can statement, that backwards design of the lesson, if you will, is kind of what the user story is all about.
The difference between doing a worksheet and understanding how to divide fractions.
Yeah.
Like that.
So once you've got your backlog, and then now we've rewritten some of these backlog items as user stories to make sure that for all the reasons that we just talked about, now we're going to prioritize. And this is another important feature here, is we're going to look for the most value for the least effort, that impact and effort matrix, if you will, the bang for the buck. And we'll kind of do that from top to bottom. So the things at the bottom, you can go ahead and go to that. The things at the bottom may be things that, you know what, like if that didn't get done, that wouldn't be the end of the world. Whereas the things at the top, we absolutely want to have that. So we're factoring these things into prioritizing. So to back up, with Scrum, you create a backlog, and then we're always refining that backlog as we go. And so this prioritization is part of that refinement process. And is there anything else you would say about the prioritization, Mike, that I've missed so far?
No, I think it's kind of always that dance between what needs to be done first because other things have to come after it, and what's the most important thing you can get done in the earliest part. For example, when we built the Northern Star Online website, one of the tasks that we had in there was you could find out about our staff. But we put that at the bottom because that wasn't as important as being able to register for classes and search through the course catalog. So 2 weeks later, we had to move on to other things. We didn't get to the staff thing, and we said, well, we'll just leave that for later, and we launched the site. So it wasn't a critical piece. All right, so now we come to another part of Scrum. And maybe Ben can add into a little bit here too, but this is a third element where Scrum tends to be very different from traditional work management systems. And this is the idea of making work visible. And if you hear Jeff Sullivan, kind of the godfather of Scrum, talk about this, he has a talk on TED Talks too. This is his one point. One of the most powerful things about Scrum is that you can look at this thing which is called the Kanban and be able to have a visual picture of not only what needs to be done in the tasks that are doing and the things that are being worked on, but where each thing is in the process. And you do this by what's called a Kanban. And a Kanban basically is we're taking all the little pieces of these tasks and user stories that we've created, and we're putting them into columns that show what stage that piece of work is at.
Yeah. I'll say one other thing. Well, you can go to the zoomed in version. One thing that really helps, Mike talked about making it visual, is also that idea that it becomes like a mental tool that you can see all your work and that you can know it's there and that you can be okay with where the work is at and where your stuff is at. A lot of times when we teach on Scrum, I use this Bill Murray line, which I love, which is, he says, my bed is a magical place where I remember all the stuff I'm supposed to do. And if you're, again, a teacher or somebody with an education background, or really just anybody that does a lot of work, you probably know that kind of nagging anxiety feeling of like not being on top of everything. And while this Scrum can't assure that you're always going to be on top of everything, this Kanban just gives you this visual place to put stuff. So if I have that nagging feeling lying in bed at night, like, oh, shoot, I've got that IEP progress report due at the end of the week, I haven't started it, rather than lying awake ruminating on that, I can add it to my backlog, my special education backlog, where I keep that part of my work. And then I know it's there. And literally, and this is in some of the brain science, that closes this feedback loop in my head. Now I can rest and I know the work is there. So the whole time, everything we've talked about now, we're really just talking about like gathering up the things you do, refining them into this backlog, and now turning your backlog into this Kanban tool, which is going to guide our Scrum process. It all might seem a little trivial so far, but I'm telling you, this process really works and really does help calm those feelings of like, am I getting all my stuff done? Do I have a handle on it? What's coming at me next? This Kanban tool sort of solves that, at least for me, and I think for a lot of people I've talked to about it. So
yeah, and to kind of lead into a little bit about what a very simple one would look like, this visual representation here basically has 4 columns. So we've got a backlog, which is all the tasks and work that we've created and thought of so far. And then we have 3 columns beside that. The first column is the to-do column, because the next stage we're going to pull a portion of that backlog into the to-do column and not worry about everything else. We're just going to focus on a portion of the work. Then once people start working on stuff, they're going to move those cards into the doing column. And then once things are done, they're going to move it into the done column. Now, as you start to use this, you may create more columns because you might want approval. So they can get more complicated, but it all builds off this kind of core essence. And as we get to the end of the session too, one of the things that's probably worth mentioning right now is we're showing kind of a very kind of organic, if you would, paper-based type of system. You'll see companies use these often on whiteboards that are in a shared space. We're also going to share some digital tools, some free digital tools that can help manage this in a digital fashion. And all of them work great. The idea is that you've got some place where the team can go and they can see this kind of visual representation of the work.
I'm really glad you mentioned that, Mike. When we got trained in our certified Scrum Master training, it was a completely digital free 2-day training, no computers, nothing on a screen. Everything was on paper and on posters and on cards. And or you can do the entire thing digitally, which we'll show you later in terms of managing that visualization aspect.
So at this point in time, if we kind of go back to our birthday party project analogy, we've got our 4-column Kanban. We've got a backlog of all the work that we've thought of we're going to do. We've kind of reworked what we could into user stories. And right now, all this work is sitting in a backlog. We really haven't taken that next step of what are we going to do right away? What's the first place we're going to start? Although, you know, we kind of get at that with prioritization, but now it's time to talk about sprinting.
Yeah, your first sprint. So we're going to sprint, right? We're going to work really hard. We're going to grind ourselves into a pull-up working, right? No, actually the sprint is the exact opposite intent of that. So you see the word sprint, you might be thinking like, oh no, now we're really going to grind. But actually the sprint is an idea of a set time box. It's from now until then. Let's sprint for 1 week. Let's sprint for 3 weeks. What that means is whatever length of time you determine, you're going to say, here's the backlog items that we're going to tackle during this sprint. And then within that time box, you're not going to let other work come in. You're not going to let people throw monkey wrenches in or curveballs in. If other things come up, it goes into the backlog, because guess what? We have a process for getting to those things in the backlog. So the sprint is actually really respectful of workers. It really tries to get at, how much does a team accomplish, roughly in a certain amount of time. And a lot of, like Scrum teams in the software development sector, they might do 3-week sprints, all throughout the year. With this birthday party project, we're imagining it's 2 weeks from now, and we're going to do 2 1-week-long sprints. That just means after a week, we're going to kind of revisit our backlog, check back in with where we're at, and set some new to-dos for our next sprint. Anything else you'd say about the sprint?
Yeah, one thing that I think that I often hear as an educator, 2 things I want to mention. You touched on one, which is the idea that when I first heard the word sprint, I'm like, okay, I get it now. So the idea is we're just going to grind workers for 80 hours a week and make sure they have this amazing, huge, long list of tasks to get done. I see how sprint works. And actually all the research on sprint is, like, as Ben mentioned, the exact opposite, where it's this kind of first sprint, the work that's going to be done in this first sprint is determined by consensus of the team that's doing it. They have the right to say, given all other responsibilities and priorities and work, that yes, this is a reasonable amount of work that we feel like we can get done. The second thing to say is one of the pieces that we're leaving off a little bit because of this is the idea of work estimation. So there's a way to take work estimation within this and build a more complex model, but we're not going to talk about that today because of time constraints. But there is an element in here to get a little bit more granular with this.
Sure.
And so those 2 pieces I think are worth mentioning as well. And so if we go from there.
Yeah, so for our simulation, we said, okay, let's pull off these items from our backlog and put them into our sprint. You can see them there. Guests receive advance notice, so we got to get the invitations out. Our son can enjoy time with his 20 closest friends, so that's going to decide who's going to be invited. Our son will enjoy personalized birthday cake, so let's get that. So we've chosen 5 out of our 11 items that we think, prioritization, they need to be done first, or we think it's like more important that we can get those done. And we feel like it's about, since we're doing a 2-week, or since we're doing 2 1-week sprints, that it's about half of the work.
Yeah, and the other thing I think I maybe add in terms of an educational perspective, and we hear this a lot, I hear this a lot from teachers when we're talking about using Scrum in an educational environment, is that a lot of times, depending upon the nature of your work, you're going to have things that just come up, work that comes up, and emergencies that have to be handled. For me, I can generally have about half of my day is something that I can control, and about the other half is usually responding to various emails and calls and people that need stuff done quickly and things like that. And so what I do for this is I kind of have various Scrum tasks or Scrum projects that I'm working on. But if an emergency comes up someplace else, then of course I have to deal with that. But when I can dig into it within the context of that project, people aren't allowed to add items to the backlog for this particular project. So I have part of my day I can do Scrum-like things, and part of my day I have to be off in the real world handling things as they come up.
The other one thing that is really helpful on a personal productivity level with the idea of the sprint too is just to avoid the multitasking trap, right? If you're kind of paid attention, clued in these days to like how the technology is kind of impacting us and sort of all the level of distraction that we're kind of steeped in right now. This process, having the sprint, is sort of a way to say, this is what I'm focusing on, and I'm going to sort of monotask, if you will, as opposed to multitask, which a lot of research is showing multitasking can be really inefficient unless you're doing it, certain types of things that can kind of be automatic in your brain. But so yeah, the sprint process, really just a way to sort of keep yourself on task on the personal productivity level too.
Probably the last thing to say about this too, when we often do this in groups, one of the things that people will do is they think they have to plan all the sprints at once, but you just plan the first one. So in this case of our birthday party example, you're going to say, okay, we have 2 weeks. We're going to do 2 1-week sprints. What are we going to try to get done in the first week? And we're going to try to carve off about half the task. So we've moved things like the invitations have to be done first and things like that. And you'll notice at this point in time too, that the work really hasn't been assigned yet. It's really now in this next stage, if we go into here, where we start talking about the stand-up and the daily Scrum, this is where people start pulling tasks off. Is this mine?
I think so.
Okay, great. So we're at the point now with our birthday project where we've picked off a portion of the tasks here. We picked off 5 tasks that are going to be done in this current sprint. It's going to be a week. And now it's time to do the work. So what's going to happen here is that various people will say, okay, I'm going to do these 2 tasks. I'm going to do this task. And there might be a few left in the to-do column that no one's really picked up yet. But the idea is that when one person finishes a task, they're going to be able to jump in and do the next one. So people go off and do their work. And one of the big elements behind Scrum is a way to monitor the work on a frequent basis as it's being done throughout the course of a sprint. Now, Scrum doesn't like meetings, but there are places where meetings happen. The first is the project planning meeting, when you organize the whole backlog and you get together and you decide your first sprint and what stuff's going to be in it and all the tasks that need to be done. But there are what are called stand-ups. And stand-ups are basically very short meetings that happen in a traditional Scrum deployment. They happen every day. If they're longer than 10 minutes, you're doing them wrong. And when you get good at them, they can be done in 5 minutes or less. And basically, it's everybody that gets together who's working on the project, that's on the team, gets together. The product owner generally doesn't have to be there because it's not a good use of their time. They're going to get filled in as things go on, although there may be communication from the Scrum Master to the product owner as these things go on. But the basic stand-up, the daily stand-up is a meeting usually done at the beginning of a day. People gather together in a circle, and each person goes around very quickly and answers 3 questions. Question number 1 is, what did I do yesterday? What am I going to do today? And what's getting in my way? And it might very well be, oh, there's nothing getting in my way. And it's designed to be quick. You don't show the work. You don't elaborate. You just say, I got this done. I'm going to do this. And this is what in my way. So with the birthday one, for example, if we look at this example in here, we've got the doing pile. So as the father, the papa, has gone off and said, kids can enjoy 2 forms of special entertainment. The mother has picked 2 tasks kind of geared with the invitations. So if we came up, do you want to be the father or the mother?
Sure, I'll be the mother.
Okay.
Okay, so
we'll do what this is what a sprint stand-up
simulator stand-up. So yesterday I was able to, what's our son's name? I'll go with my son, Simon. I was able to sit down with Simon and we came up with his list of 20 friends. So we've got that taken care of. I didn't get the invitations done yet, but I'm gonna go pick those up at the store today. Nothing's getting in my way right now. But other than I'm wondering how much do you think we should spend on the invitations?
Okay, great. And I worked on getting 2 forms of special entertainment. I was thinking a pony would be good. And I called a couple of pony places, but 2 weeks from now, they're all booked out. So I'm a little bit stuck on that. What I hope to today is to talk to some people and to find some more places. But yeah, I'm a little bit stuck on figuring out where a pony is supposed to come from. So I might rethink that.
So that was our stand-up.
Yeah. And it's now a couple of things that this is one, we'll talk a little bit about this later. This is one place where it often breaks down, especially with educators, because we want to be helpful and we want to solve the problem. And this particular element of the stand-up is where the Scrum Master's role is really important. The Scrum Master is noting where places where people are getting stuck. And the Scrum Master is going to come back in either as that's happening and say, okay, we'll talk after or set that up. But the Scrum Master is responsible for getting people unstuck, unless it can be solved with 1 or 2 quick sentences. So for example, Ben might say, I'm wondering how much we should be able to spend. If I know that answer, I could say, okay, so I was looking and I think we have about $200, $300 to do the whole party in my bank account. Can you do the invitations for like $30?
Yeah.
And then it's done and it's solved. But if you can't solve it in 1 or 2 sentences, it gets put to the side and it's the Scrum Master's responsibility for help that person get that person unstuck.
And if you think about, again, a lot of times I think about the Scrum as like an efficient process compared to sometimes like the inefficient processes that we can default to when we do committee work or have meetings. If you think about meetings, you've been at committee meetings where a lot of times people just talked about issues and just clarified problems and things that got stuck. Scrum really wants to kind of buck that. It really wants to kind of say, no, we're not going to fall into that trap, the meeting trap, the talking, clarifying. Presumably we've already talked. We already know we want to have a birthday party. We've already clarified things. Now we're doing things. So that's another huge piece of Scrum is when once we've got that backlog and we've done that planning, we're going to come back to planning later, but we're not just going to keep doing that in an ongoing way. Now we're doing things when we're in our sprint.
All right. And here's what one might look like a little bit further into the process. So in this case, the mother has moved a couple of things over to the done pile and has grabbed a couple of items. The father, unfortunately, still is struggling with the forms of entertainment, so we might need to figure out a way to get that unstuck. But the important thing is here, you've got that visual representation. If you just looked at this right now, you could see what's done, you could see what people are working on, and you could see the tasks left in the backlog that still need to be done. So
And it's
visual
so
representation.
satisfying. It's so satisfying to move the things over. And if you ever do anything like this with kids, I know people have done Scrum boards for like shore charts in their house. I think Mike even told me about somebody who scrummed their marriage. But it's super satisfying to move things over the right-hand column. And when you see things move over, it's very fulfilling. I know it seems, again, a little bit trivial, but when you're going through the work and you're using that visual process to sort of benchmark it, it really sort of fuels you. And for me, I find myself becoming more effective and more efficient, just that little motivation of seeing the progress. So.
The other nice thing about that too is oftentimes I feel like I'm not getting much done. And then I go into the Scrum board and whatever, and I look at it, and I look at the done column, and I realize there's a dozen things there. It's like, oh yeah, actually, we're making progress. That happens more often than I realize.
We're going to talk about the digital one later, and this is even maybe a little vain, but like in my digital one, I can scroll down, my done column is like, I got like 3 years worth of dones in there. And sometimes I'm having just like, oh yeah, okay, I've actually gotten quite a bit of stuff done. So
right.
yeah, when you're feeling like you're not getting anything done.
So to continue on, I'll just wrap up in terms of the stand-ups. So those stand-ups happen on a daily basis. Now, they can happen, we've used them by email for slower moving projects. Sometimes we do them once a week. Sometimes we do them twice a week. We've kind of riffed off of that basic idea of a group of people standing in a circle just because of the nature that our educational institution works. So there's a lot of different ways to get at that. We've done them, again, emailing. I got this done yesterday. I'm going to do this today. I'm not stuck anywhere. All out to the group. We've done them digitally in other ways and things like that too. They can be done via phone calls or anything like that.
Yeah, dailies usually seems unrealistic, at least for us in the K-12 setting, that the people you're working with on, they're with students 6 hours a day typically. So you're not going to be able to hold daily meetings and that kind of thing. But if we've got something we're working on, we can maybe do it weekly, we can maybe do it once a month, whatever is kind of appropriate for what we're trying to do.
Right.
So.
And so basically that happens over the course of the sprint. So a week would go by and you're going to have, hopefully most of the things will move over to the done column. There might be still a couple lingering in the doing column. There might be still one in the to-do column that you didn't get to, but you get to the end of it. And now you have what's called the sprint review, which really kind of brings us, it's a review of that work that's done. And do you want to?
Yeah, just so the sprint review, another word for that is the sprint retrospective, you'll see. And we'll share some websites and stuff with you later. But if you kind of look around, there's people have some really creative ways of doing these reviews and really kind of effective ways at getting a team to kind of look at, okay, what was the work we just accomplished? How did it go? Goods and bads, all that stuff. And it leads right into planning your next sprint. So we talk about iterative production. Those of you who are like in higher ed or whatever, maybe into writing, all about iterations and how good of a process that is to iterate your work. And Scrum is really built around that. Is we're going to sprint, we review, we plan the next one, then we sprint again. So the sprint review or retrospective, just kind of a benchmark meeting at the end of the sprint. How did we do?
Yeah, and there's 3 components to it. The first part is that the group actually, the product owner comes into this meeting, the group shows what's been done, the product owner approves it at that point in time and says, yeah, this is really good. So now you've got that check where the product owner is kind of checking in with the project and the visible production of the product. Then you go on and you plan the next sprint, and then you always take a segment at the end to say, what did we do well? What can we do better? So there's an idea of kind of refining.
I'll just say there's a little bit of text on the screen too that we haven't maybe touched on specifically. So deliverables, again, that's just the idea of, like Mike was talking about, like with the Northern Star Online website, what's the user experience? What's the deliverable thing? What's done? What do we have that's ready to go? If I think about, like, as a teacher, if I'm creating a unit plan, the whole thing might not be done, but what is done? Are my lesson objectives there? Is my assessment there? What's deliverable? What's done? And then waterfall versus Scrum. The idea of waterfall is, again, that traditional project management can also be described as a relay race where one thing has to lead to the next thing, has to lead to the next thing, has to lead to the next thing. If you think about a relay race, if the second person with the baton, falls, all 4 team members lose the race. Scrum anticipates people are going to fall. Scrum anticipates things aren't going to get done. Scrum anticipates life's going to happen. And so that's why we review and we set the next sprint. It's working in iterations.
And that's also where tasks that hadn't been thought of initially would come in, because as a task that you thought about or something that needs to get done, you would stick that in the backlog. And now at the sprint review, you're going to go back to the backlog, refine those tasks again, make sure everything's there, and then pull off another portion for the next sprint. And basically at that point, it's a lather, rinse, repeat until the whole project is done. And you're all finished. And so with that in mind, that's kind of Scrum in a nutshell. And hopefully we've highlighted some of the points. I did want to take a quick moment, because we've been doing this for quite a while now, for 4 years, and we've seen basically 3 places where our most common mistakes. And I would say these are the top 3 things that break Scrums. Number one, especially for educators, are long daily stand-ups. My wife works at the University of Minnesota, and her group has started using it. And she was telling me that their stand-ups now are commonly a half an hour. And people are talking about the weekends and they're socializing and things like that. And she says, wow, yeah, they just eat up so much time. That happens so much more commonly than not. No, so you can socialize after, you can socialize before, but you start them on time, and you have to get to the point where that Scrum Master can manage that process that they're taking no more than 10 minutes. And ideally 5 should really be your benchmark. I was talking to someone, roommates from college's son who works for Amazon, and he was saying, yeah, when they first started out, they had a Scrum Master come in and work with their team, and their stand-ups were taking a long time, but over the course of that first month, he got them down to 5 minutes with 20 people. And so that's how fast they go through now. The second would be breaking from reality, is that I've seen groups come in and they plan a Scrum like this, and then they go off and work and they don't use the Scrum board and they just start doing stuff. And it was like, well, that was a nice mental exercise, but it didn't really get the work that needed to be done. So it's really important at the beginning to stress, you're talking about the work that needs to be done, and there's a commitment to get at it. The last thing is process ownership, which I've seen people finish a meeting and they look at the Scrum board as something that the Scrum Master should play with, but everybody moves that stuff. If you're working on it, you get a card, you want to move it, and you want to have people moving on it. So that's a sense of ownership by the group. That. And those are all things that get better over time.
That's been a big one for me, that process ownership or the breaking from reality. Both those can manifest as like a false start. Like you'll say, hey, I got the Scrum. It's a great thing. I just learned about it on this webinar. We got to do it. It's going to wholly clean up our process. And you'll set it up. But then, yes, you'll walk on to the next thing and kind of, when you revisit, kind of not stay focused on it, not own the process, and not really do it. And then you're kind of just back to where you were before. It was a mental exercise. So.
And when we've seen groups do it really well, they generally avoid all these pitfalls.
Yes.
You know, they say, yeah, we're doing it. And first our stand-ups were 15 minutes, and now they're down to 5 and stuff like that. So we did want to share with you, and I think we're going to have time for questions for the last 10, 15 minutes, but we wanted to share a few resources before that.
So just some resources for you. Again, Scrum and Agile is like a really wide global, practice in terms of getting work done. So, don't take our word for it. Go out there and learn about it for yourself and see what you might do with it. We've both read, and I've given this book to several people. The Scrum book, The Art of Doing Twice the Work in Half the Time. It's got a really cheesy sales pitchy title, but it is very, very good. It highlights that FBI Sentinel story and some other really great examples, kind of help you understand like the impact of this process. 2 really good websites there, Tasty Cupcakes and innovationgames.com. You'll just find like all kinds of stuff there that kind of all the various practitioners of Scrum and Agile over the last 30 years or so, like the experts out there in the field kind of share a lot of their good stuff there, a lot of their good tools they've developed. Games is a cool prioritization game we learned about one time called Game of 35, where you can kind of get a group together and kind of, you've got some competing ideas, kind of that beginning stage of the project, like what are we going to do, and coming to that consensus. So really good stuff there. Agile Classrooms is a website from somebody down in the Southwest United States who's really trying to bring this methodology into elementary schools and really trying to help teachers use this a way to just manage their classroom flow. A lot of really cool visuals on there. I really recommend checking out his learning canvas visual. It really kind of shows, it's a really cool take on a Scrum board for a classroom setting. And then the Scrum Alliance, scrumalliance.org, that's just the kind of like official home of Scrum. That's where you can get certified. You can find out where you can take classes on it and that kind of thing. So.
And I guess the only thing I'd add to that is if you're thinking to get started, I would encourage you to just try a project on your own. Just do it. You will learn so much. And even your initial efforts right now, it's starting, and you might think you don't know a lot. I think you'll find there's improvement over traditional process. And if you do like to read The Art of Doing Twice the Work in Half the Time, extraordinarily cheesy title, but it goes into detail on some other things in terms of group size. It talks about how multitasking can be detrimental to projects and things like that. So there's a lot more stuff. It also goes into work estimation, which is kind of the next stage in what we would do with a group in terms of training, is to teach groups about work estimation. So well worth it to dig in. It's also an easy read. It's a couple hundred pages and it's just smooth reading. So it's pretty easy. It's not heavy by any means. The last thing that we wanted to show you before we took questions and answers is to just kind of mention very briefly some of the Scrum digital tools that we alluded to earlier in the presentation. There's a number of ways to do this digitally, to create a Kanban digitally. There are two that we have gravitated to, and the people that we've trained tend to really gravitate towards. The first one is Trello. Both of these, let me be careful. Trello has a free version and a paid version. I've been using the free version. Unless you've got a large group, there's really a large group of people working on one particular project. I can't find a reason to go on to the paid version. So the free version is very powerful, very visual. Here's
really friendly mobile app.
Yeah.
A single sign-on with Google.
Yes. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good point too. And here's what it basically looks like. And you can add pictures and kind of color it up. You can put backgrounds in and stuff like that. This is basically a Kanban for what I use to do our family taxes. And so we've got just the sprint. Everything's done in one sprint because I'm just going to do it. There's not, so it's just the sprint. Then what we're doing. Then if it's something that I've done, but I need my wife to do something, then it goes into that doing waiting column, then the done column, and then I use a little bit of work estimation.
Do you want to quick tell them, just because they're seeing that, what those numbers to the right of each card signify? I know we didn't talk about estimation. But.
Yeah. One of the issues that comes up with Scrum is that not all tasks are equal.
Yeah.
Some tasks may take a lot longer to do than another task. And so work estimation, which is basically the next step in this process to learning how to do that, can be very helpful in semi-complex projects to determine how much work you should do in a particular sprint and how fast the group is going. It can also give you a better indication of how much work is left to do than just having a bunch of cards, because you could have some pretty challenging cards left to do and you've done some of the easier ones. And so this tries to solve that problem.
If you're the type of person that sometimes naturally takes that path of least resistance or likes to do those easy things first, I know when I've worked with students around planning their projects for class or whatever, we'll sometimes even just do like, red, yellow, and green, red being like the big important things that we want to make sure you don't miss. And then we'll talk to kids like, what happens if we just do all the greens first and leave all the reds for the end? That's gonna not work out, so yep. Yeah, so it's just assigning a value to help with the prioritization and management of the work.
And so I love Trello. I mostly use Trello. One of the other things, the tools, is Kanbanchi, and I believe I haven't looked at it in the past few weeks, and they did make some changes, but there are I think there's some free versions for educators that still have the high level of power. I do have to kind of put a caveat on that because I know they did make some changes recently, but a number of our staff use it. The nice thing about Kanbanchi is that it connects directly with Google accounts, so you can share a card like you can share a Google Doc, which is really helpful. And you can also put tasks that then you can plug into your Google Calendar. So the integration with Kanbanchi into Google is really good. And we're a Google district, so a lot of the staff that we work with love Kanbanchi because it allows them to collaborate very easy on projects. Both of the tools are highly recommended. Ben mentioned Trello has a good mobile interface. It's got a really good app. Kanbanchi isn't good for phone usage, it doesn't work very well on phones. So that's one there. A couple of others. Smartsheets is good for very much more complex projects, but it's got a great way to create tasks for a larger project. It is fee-based, but if you're doing a project that large, this fee would probably be incidental to that cost. I think that brings us to the end.
Yeah.
Right. I
yeah,
suppose
we're
we
ready
can stop sharing the screen here and take some questions.
We're ready for questions.
Yeah, there are some questions in the chat window that have been directed to the panelists. If you guys want to take a look at those. One that we got a lot are people who are asking if you can share your Prezi presentation.
Yes, we should have mentioned that at the beginning. Our apologies. Absolutely. I'm not sure the best way to do that, but we will share it maybe with you and then you can share it out to the group. Would that be the best way to do that?
Yeah, we are going to put this video on YouTube, as I mentioned at the beginning, and the Z link that I gave you at the beginning, I'll give it to you guys at the end, and I'll put it in the chat here. It has past webinars at the bottom, and that's where this one will migrate to after today, and we can put a link there for you too.
Great. And people also, both Ben and I were on Twitter. I'm at Mike Smart, and then Ben.
I'm at Skol Teacher, like SKOL Teacher. Yeah, like instead of school teacher. I thought that was a clever handle. So, if anybody's a Viking fan in here.
Yeah, and so if we both love to work on this stuff. So if you would love, if you got questions or you start out and you get stuck or you're like, wait, what was that? Or something comes up, feel free to reach out to us, email, Twitter, whatever would be great.
I see one question on there, what if you're the Scrum Master and you're stuck, and your goal is your job is to get other people unstuck. couple, I mean, you get in kind of complexities of what your specific team looks like, but in sort of the textbook Scrum implementation, if you're probably going to go to the product owner, hey, as I'm, working with the Scrum team, here's a place we're stuck. We're going to kind of need a decision this way or that way. So for me, like if I'm as an instructional coach in my school and I'm working with my teachers on something and I'm stuck, I would need to go to like my principal, school principal, or one of my supervisors, that kind of thing, to get a little guidance.
One of the questions here, the free software, so hopefully we've answered that. I would look at both Trello and Kanban for that. Let's see.
Just Google it too. Just Google Scrum apps or Scrum software or Agile software. There's tons of stuff out there. These are just the ones that we've really can like vouch for, So yeah, if you want to save yourself some time, Trello or Kanban. There's other Kanban stuff out there too. We've already said this, but Agile, Scrum, and even the word Kanban itself, there are distinctions there, but for our purposes, kind of interchangeable. So as you're looking around for stuff, you can try all three of those words: Agile, Scrum, and Kanban.
A couple questions here too. How does Scrum compare to design thinking? I think Scrum by itself is iterative in nature, and so we also do design thinking. We're big into design thinking. We love design thinking in terms of empathy. This fits very well with that. So you could build, for example, design thinking elements into a Scrum implementation. But it's probably worth mentioning too, to kind of take a bigger step back and talk about what Scrum is designed to do. So Scrum is, if you think of the creative problem solving process, is basically having 4 stages. The first stage is you're clarifying your problem. The second stage is kind of ideation, where you're coming up for solutions for your problem. The third stage is kind of development. You're developing your idea, you're refining your idea. And then the fourth stage would be the implementation stage. We're actually doing the project. Scrum is designed to handle the third and fourth stages. It's a planning process and it's an implementation process. It's not designed for figuring out what you need to do.
Yes.
So if you don't know what your idea that you're going to act on is yet, that's where I would bring in a lot of design thinking things. So you're kind of doing empathy interviews with people. You're doing brainstorming to kind of get to your solution. So design thinking could be necessarily done at that stage. And now, once you know what you want to do, okay, we're going to bring Scrum in because we're going to plan the process to act on it. So it's really designed kind of for the back end. It's an implementation tool designed for the back end of the creative problem solving model. Having said that, within that, you can kind of get a sense for the iterative nature of sprints, where you're going to think about as much as you can get done, then you're going to do it, then you're going to replan and do it again, and replan and do it again. That in itself is kind of very cyclical and comes up with very traditional design thinking.
And I was going to say, if you look at, like, if you go on Tasty Cupcakes, for example, or Innovation Games, you'll see like different games and meeting formats and things, like, for example, for sprint reviews or sprint retrospectives and for sprint planning meetings. And you'll see, like, in some of the really good ones, you'll see those human-centered design or design thinking elements in like the sprint planning type of format. So, but I think I'm glad Mike mentioned the 4 stages, the clarifying, the generating ideas, developing the ideas, and then implementing. When we've looked at research on educators skew over here. We like to clarify what the problem is. We like to analyze the problem. We like to talk about what the problem is. We like to put our finger right on it. Academics, we like to name it. We like to identify it. We like to define it. We don't skew as really good developers, implementers. So for us, that's where Scrum has been so useful. That's where it's really helped us. It's nudged us, and not only myself as an individual, but like our organization to be more action oriented, more doing things oriented, and a little bit less always talking about things oriented. So.
And we do see a question to put up the emails and things, so we've got those up there. There was a question I saw a couple times, and I wasn't ignoring it. We just wanted to kind of take them as we could. In terms of that breaking from reality, how do you get people back to it? One of the best ways is, I think the best way to get that is to avoid it at the start by planning both the training of your team and that first meeting where you're trying to get the backlog of items done, to make sure to really get consensus that this is the work that needs to be done. Oftentimes I've seen people kind of thinking about things and they create a list of stuff to do, but they're not putting everything there. So there's still 10 things they might need to do before they get to the actual project. So really spending time with the group to make sure that this is it, and also getting into the stage at the end of that first thing where they've pulled off their first sprint and people have been assigned tasks. So they're leaving that first meeting, which can take 1.5 hours to 2 hours if you've got a rather large project. They're leaving that first meeting knowing what they've got done, and that first stand-up is planned. so that they know between now and that next time they're going to meet, which might be 2 days, they're expected to make progress on those tasks. So it's really driving home that connection between the backlog, the Kanban, their planning, and the work that actually needs to be done. Because oftentimes where I've seen it breaks down is people will say, well, I have to do this first before I can actually get to this task. Okay, wait a second, that has to be there. You know, is this the first thing you need to do, and making sure that it's there?
Yeah.
The other thing is sometimes it does take a regrouping, and it takes and that would be something that you would get at in that sprint retrospective, would be to say, like, I feel like I'm doing a lot of different things, but they're in this project, but they're not in the Kanban.
Yeah.
They say, okay, what are those things? Let's make sure they're tasks. So you can use that retrospective to regather the group and pull it back in.
And one place we didn't actually name as a pitfall, but is a common pitfall, is the idea of group size. So sometimes when they're getting that break from reality too, it could be that the group is a little too big. Scrum says, you know, like 3 to 5, 4 to 6 people is a great size for a team to develop and implement. If you've got, you know, that 12 to 15 to 20 person group, it's going to be tougher to manage because of all the different lines of communication. So, yeah.
I'm not seeing new questions come up. I'm wondering if we missed any. I've been scrolling through them here, taking a look and trying to address them. If there's one we've missed here, maybe if someone wants to just enter it in quick. And I know we're also approaching the end of our allotted time. We're happy to stay as well, but that's interesting. Office 365, and it looks like a Kanban can be done in Microsoft Teams, so I'll have to check that out. Wonderful. Yeah, I'm curious about that too. Thank you for putting the link in.
I would love to say to anybody on here too, I would love an email if you try this, if you use it, if it gets great results, or even if it totally sucks. I'd love to know if people take this and actually do something with it, and kind of like how it went for them.
And that would be my recommendation, is don't wait. Take a small project, even an individual project, a small something, even a personal project you're doing home, like get this, clean this room, and break it down and try it, because you'll learn so much from that. I'll put the contact information back up here. It says, where can you find your contact information? I'll share the screen again that has that on it. There we go. So there's both our emails and our Twitter handles. And when I do that, I can't seem to see the, oh, maybe I can move this. No, I can't see the chat there then. But so I'll put that up briefly, and then I'll take that back. Also, we'll share the presentation out so you can get it that way as well. Thank you so much, everybody, for giving us your time. I noticed that we saw about 60 people in there at a peak or so, and so it's been really fun to share this with you. And again, please feel free to reach out with questions. And like Ben mentioned, we'd love to hear your success stories or places where you may have tried it and say, hey, wondering how we can do this better too.
Yeah, great attendance. Clearly a subject that people are really interested in. You two are really dynamic together, so I really enjoyed that.
You know, it is something I think too, that one of the things that we find is that it resonates with people, because I think it's a sign of our times. We're all struggling with too much to do.
It's the frog in the boiling pot of water, for sure. This is helping with that, absolutely.
And it was interesting too, because I think it was September of last year when our school started up, and I've been using it now both on an individual basis, and someone came up to me and said, wow, I'm feeling really stressed. And I do think that usually my Septembers have been extraordinarily stressful, because it's the start of our school year. We're kind of gearing back up, and a lot of work comes in at that point in time. But I do thinking, it's like, remember to myself, wow, no, it doesn't feel that stressful anymore.
Yeah.
Because of some of the things that Ben mentioned, with the visibility of work, with the idea that we can see what we need to do, and that everything is sitting there, it helps me to focus a lot better. And I think a lot of that stress that we feel comes from not knowing what the next thing to do is. So, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, you guys are great. I'm just going to share our Z-Link one more time for people who want to find that YouTube link later along with the presentation. And then also just remind people to join us again next month on March 26th for Developing Creativity in the Classroom. Thank you both so much again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.